Japan is facing a major economic problem. In their latest review of the Japanese economy, the Economist reported flat consumption, wages not keeping pace with price increases, and a GDP that contracted by 2.1% in Q3 of 2023. Deloitte's October analysis found that domestic demand is sluggish, inflation has outpaced the target for 7 consecutive months, and the yen has dramatically depreciated to just below 150 per US dollar. Despite being the world's third largest economy, it is clear that things do not look like they're going well for Japan. The burning question in everyone's head is, why is this happening? What is causing these economic problems? And more importantly, will Japan recover, or are we witnessing Japan's economic collapse? To answer these questions, we first need to go back to Japan's lost decade, where all these problems first started. Coming out of World War II and entering the 1950s, Japan saw an unprecedented amount of growth in their previously devastated economy. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 created a huge demand for Japanese goods and set off a chain-link reaction that laid the foundations for a long period of extraordinary economic activity. By the 1980s, Japan's economy was the envy of the world. It had become on par with top countries and was even outpacing them for a time. The GDP growth rate of Japan throughout the 80s was 3.89%, whereas the US was only at 3.07%. Clearly, Japan was onto something big. While it looked like nothing could stop Japan from becoming the next economic superpower, a sudden crash in 1991 completely changed the trajectory of Japan's economy overnight. Stock values dropped by 60%, the value of real estate collapsed by a staggering 70%, leaving many people's houses worthless compared to just a few years ago. And from 1995 to 2007, real wages shrunk by 5% and Japan's GDP fell by $1 trillion. This one crash practically put a huge stop to the Japanese economy for the entirety of the 1990s, which is why it is known as Japan's lost decade. But what happened to so suddenly and so intensely collapse Japan's rising economy to the point where we can still see its effects today? I'll give you a hint. It's part of why this 2-story, 4-bedroom, 1,600 square foot house in the heart of Tokyo is only worth about $700,000 US. You see, Japan's booming economy in the 1980s, coupled with the Bank of Japan's expansionary monetary policy, caused assets like stock prices and real estate to greatly inflate in price. While a small amount of inflation is a healthy side effect of an active and growing economy, too much inflation is obviously not a good thing. And since inflation happens when an economy grows, the main way governments control high inflation is by trying to slow down the economy. And how do they slow down the economy, you ask? Well, the government raises interest rates. This way, things become more expensive and people start spending less money, slowing the economy down. And this is exactly what the Bank of Japan tried to do to fix the high inflation, but the problem was that they took way too long to act. They let inflation get so high that by the time the interest rate hikes came, Japan's asset bubble burst, house and stock prices fell to the floor, and the economy tanked into a downward spiral. The crazy thing is that this is not even the worst part. Once the economy tanked and everything was super slow, how do you think the Bank of Japan tried to fix it? Well, if raising rates slows down the economy, I'm sure you can imagine that lowering them starts to speed things back up again. At least, that's what's supposed to happen if it weren't for the liquidity trap. What would you do if you saved up a bunch of money to buy an investment property, but the economy is so bad that every month the house you want to buy gets lower and lower in price since no one wants to buy it? You're definitely not going to buy the house just for it to be worth less than what you paid for only a month later. So you do what any rational person does and hold their cash to wait for things to get better. The problem is that for things to get better, people need to start spending their money. It's a catch-22. No one wants to spend their money since they think the economy is in a rut, but the economy is in a rut since no one wants to spend money. This cycle traps the economy in a state of stagnation as everyone holds onto their cash, which is why it is called the liquidity trap. And this liquidity trap is what happened to Japan's economy post-bubble that allowed for a decades-long recession. But that was in the 90s, you're saying. What about now? Well, the thing is, Japan has never really been able to make a strong comeback since then. From 2011 to 2019, Japan's GDP grew an average of just under 1% per year. Then, COVID hit. Only now are some positive signs for Japan's economy starting to show, but before we start getting optimistic on their recovery, we first have to cover another major threat to the Japanese economy, and this one is much harder to fix. As if the lost decade wasn't enough, there has been a silent problem lurking in Japan for years that, if not fixed, could kill the Japanese economy for good. So what is this problem? Why is it so hard to fix? And more importantly, how's it impacting Japan? To first understand the problem at hand, we have to turn to demographic economics and learn something called the dependency ratio. The dependency ratio measures the amount of dependence in a country compared to their total population. This metric is important because it is used to measure the economic burden of a country's workforce. The concept is simple. The more non-working people or dependents there are in a country, the more reliant the economy is on just a few people. You calculate the dependency ratio by dividing the total amount of dependence in a country by the working population and multiplying by 100. Therefore, the higher the dependency ratio, the greater the proportion of dependents exist in a country. And you don't need to be a genius economist to understand why a high dependency ratio might not be the best thing for an economy. Calculating dependence is also surprisingly simple. It is a percentage of the population that is younger than 15 and older than 64. The idea is that while there are some exceptions, generally speaking, most kids 14 and under don't work since they are too young, and most adults 65 and older don't work because they are retired. So while assuming the entire workforce is in between these ages is not 100% accurate, it does the job well enough and makes calculating the ratio fairly easy. While we now know what the dependency ratio is and how to calculate it, the burning question is, what is Japan's dependency ratio and what does that tell us about their economy? And this is where we get into the heart of Japan's fundamental economic problem. Look at this bar chart of Japan's dependency ratio from 2015 to 2022. Now look at this line graph of Japan's GDP from the same period. As Japan's dependency ratio has increased throughout the years, their GDP has steadily decreased, with an outlier jump in growth corresponding to the end of the pandemic. You see, Japan's population is much older than the average country. Their dependency ratio for 2022 was 71.08%, meaning that almost 3/4 of the entire population is not working, and the vast majority of those people are retired. This means that Japan's economy is being held up by only 29% of the population. And while this doesn't sound like a big deal, it has enormously scary implications for the future of Japan, and it is something that is extremely hard to fix. A growing and young population is essential to maintain a healthy economic system. A shrinking or stagnant population means less consumption and less spending, which translates to less jobs, lower salaries, decreasing GDP, and every other negative economic factor you can think of. And since Japan's birth rate is also extremely low, there aren't many people coming in to replace the 29% of working adults that will age out of the workforce as the years go on. As you can imagine then, this is an extremely difficult position to be in as a country as it is so hard to fix. Think about it. Apart from immigration, what can you do to fix the population and birth rate problems within your country? You can't just force people to start having more kids. Plus, even if everyone in Japan starts having kids right now, it would take at least 2 decades for their economy to fully realize the results of this population increase. So what is Japan going to do? Clearly, the country is facing some serious economic problems that will require some next level finesse to turn around. Will Japan's leadership be able to recover and turn around the economy, or will these problems continue to suffocate Japan's economic potential? Aoki Masahiko, a prominent Japanese economist, once predicted that it would take 30 years for Japan's economy to emerge from the lost decade. According to his timeline, it would be the 2020s that would finally awaken his country's economy from a decades-long slumber. That time has come. Is Aoki right? Well, after years of deflation, Japan is seeing its fastest price growth in more than 30 years. Wages, which have long been stagnant, are now rising faster than at any time since the lost decade. As Aoki predicted, gradual institutional and generational shifts are bearing fruit and changing Japan from within. While there are still many systemic problems that need fixing, Japan's outlook hasn't looked this bright in years. And while we know the problems that need fixing, we still don't know what caused them to happen in the first place. Take the asset bubble that started Japan's lost decade. We know why it happened, but not how it happened. So if you're curious to learn more about how financial bubbles like these work and how to avoid them, I am working on a video that explains just that through the story of the first ever recorded bubble in history. Until then, I'll let YouTube decide what you should watch next. Peace.